Hatchet Chapter 13. Brian stood at the long end of the L lake and watched the water, smelled the water, listened to the water, was the water. A fish moved, and his eyes jerked sideways to see the ripples, but did not move any other part of his body. He did not raise the bow or reach into his belt pouch for a fish arrow. It was not the right kind of fish, not a food fish. The food stayed close in the shallows, did not roll that way, but made quicker movements, small movements, food movements. The large fish rolled and stayed deep and could not be taken, but it didn't matter. This morning, he was not looking for fish. Fish was a light meal, and he was sick of them. He was looking for one of the fool birds. He called them fool birds, and there was a flock that lived near the end of the long part of the lake, but something he did not understand had stopped him. He stood, breathing gently through his mouth to keep silent, letting his eyes and ears go out, and that did the work for him. It had happened this way before. Something had come into him from outside to warn him, and he had stopped. Once it had been the bear again. He had been taking the last of the raspberries, and something inside him came inside him and stopped him. And he looked where his ear said to look, and there was a female bear with cubs. Had he taken 2 more steps, he would have come between the mother and her cubs, and that was a bad place to be. As it was, the mother stood up and faced him and made a sound, a low sound in her throat, to threaten and warn him. He paid attention to that feeling now, and he stood and waited, patiently knowing he was right and that something would come. Turn, smell, listen, feel, and then a sound, a small sound. He looked up and away from the lake and saw a wolf. It's halfway up the hill from the lake, standing with its head on its head and shoulders, sticking out of a small opening, looking down on him with wide yellow eyes. He had never seen a wolf the size through him, not as big as a bear, but somehow seeming that large. The wolf claimed all that was below him as his own, and Brian took it as his own. Brian looked back and forth looked back and for a moment felt afraid, because the wolf was so right. He knew Brian knew him and owned him and chose not to do anything to him. But the fear moved away, and Brian knew the wolf for what it was, another part of the woods, another part of it. Brian relaxed the tension and the spear in his hands, settled the bow on his other hand from where it had started to come up. He knew the wolf now, as the wolf knew him, and he nodded to it, nodded and smiled. The wolf watched him for another time, another part of his life. Then it turned and walked effortlessly up the hill as if it had come out of the brush, and it was followed by 3 other wolves, all equally large and gray and beautiful, all looking down on him as he trotted past and away, and Brian nodded to each of them. He was not the same now. The Brian that stood and watched the wolves moved away and nodded to them. Was completely changed. Time had come, and time that he measured and didn't care about. Time had come into his life and moved him and left him different. In measured time, 47 days had passed since the crash. 42 days, he thought, since he died and had been reborn as the new Brian. When the plane had come and gone, he put him down, gutted him, and dropped him, and left him with nothing. The rest of the first day, he had gone down in the dark. He had let the fire go out. He had forgotten to even eat an egg, and he let his brain take him down where he was done, where he wanted to be done and gone. To this he wanted to where he wanted try the whole thing again, to where he wanted to die. He settled into a gray funk, deeper and still deeper, and finally in the dark he had gone up the ridge and taken the hatchet and tried to end by cutting himself. Madness, a hissing madness that took his brain there. There was nothing for him, and he tried to become nothing, but the cutting had been hard to do, impossible to do. He had at last fallen to his side, wishing for death, wishing for an end, and slept, only didn't sleep. His eyes closed, and his mind lay open on the rock through the night, lay and hated, and wished for it to end, and thought the word cloud down through the awful night, over and over the word, wanting the clouds to come down. But in the morning he was still there on his side. The sun came up, and he opened his eyes, and he saw the cuts on his arm, the blood turning black. He saw the blood and hated the blood, rather. Hated what he had done to himself, and hated what the old Brian hated when he was the old Brian and was weak. Two things that come to his mind, two true things. He was not the same. The plane had changed him. Had the disappointment cut him down and made him new, he was not the same and would never be again like he had been. That was the one true thing. That was one of the true things, the new thing. The other was that he would not die, and he would not let death in again. He was new. Of course, he'd made a lot of mistakes. He smiled now, walking up the shore after the wolves were gone, thinking of the early mistakes, the mistakes that came before he realized that he had to find new ways before he realized that he had to find new ways to be what he had become. He had made a new fire, which was now keeping going partially rotten wood, because the punky wood would smolder for many hours and still come back with fire. But that had been the extent of doing things right for a while. His first bow was a disaster and almost blinded him. He had sat a whole night and shaped the limbs until the bow looked beautiful. Then he spent 2 days making arrows. The shafts were willow, straight and with the bark peeled. He had fire hardened the points. And split a couple of them to make 4 points, as he had done with a spear. He had no feathers, so they just lay bare, figuring for fish that he only had to travel a few inches. He had no strings, and that threw him until he looked down at his tennis shoes. They had laces too, long, and he found that one lace cut in half would take care of both shoes, and left the other lace for a bowstring. All seemed to be going well until he tried to test the shot. He put the arrow in the string, pulled it back to his cheek, pointed it at a dirt hammock, and at the precise instant the bow exploded in his hand, sending splinters and chips of wood into his face. 2 pieces actually struck him in the forehead, just above his eyes. And then they had only been slightly lower, they would have blinded him. 2 stiff mistakes. In his mental journal, he listed them to tell his father, listed all the mistakes. He had made a new bow with slender limbs that was more fluid, a gentle pull, but could not hit the fish. He sat in the water and was, in the end, surrounded by a virtual cloud of small fish. It was infuriating. He would pull the bow back, set the arrow just above the water, and when the fish was no more an inch away, release the arrow, only to miss. It seemed to him that the arrow had gone right through the fish, again and again, but the fish didn't get hurt. Finally, after hours, he struck the arrow down in the water, pulled the bow, and waited for the fish to come closer. While he was waiting, he noticed the water seemed to make the arrow bend or break in the middle. Of course, he had forgotten that water refracts, bends light, and he had learned that somewhere, in some class, maybe biology, he couldn't remember. But it did bend light, and that meant the fish were not where they appeared to be. They were lower, just below, which meant he had to aim just under them. He would not forget his first hit, not ever. A round-shaped fish with golden sides as gold as the sun, and stopped it in front of him, of the arrows, and stopped in front of the arrows, and he had aimed just beneath it. At the edge of the fish, and released the arrow, and there was a bright flurry, a splash of gold in the water. He grabbed the arrow and raised it up, and the fish was on the end, wiggling against the blue sky. He had held the fish against the sky until it stopped wiggling, held it and looked at the sky, and felt his throat tighten, swell, and fill with pride at what he had done. He had done food with his bow and the arrow fashioned by his own hand. He had done food, found a way to live. The bow had given him that way and exulted in it. The bow in the arrow, and then the fish, in the hatchet, in the sky. He stood and walked down from the water, still holding the fish and arrow and bow against the sky, seeing them as they fit his arms. They were a part of him. He had food. He cut a green willow fork and held the fish over a fire until the skin crackled and peeled away. The meat was flaky and moist and tender. This he picked off carefully with his fingers, tasting every piece, mashing them in his mouth until with his tongue to get the juices of them. Hot, steaming pieces of fish. He could not, he thought, even get enough. All that first day, that first new day, he spent going to the lake, shooting a fish, taking it back to the fire, cooling it, eating it, and then back to the lake, shooting a fish, cooking it, eating it, and on that way until dark. He had taken the scraps back to the water with what he thought might be work for bait, and the other fish came and by the hundreds to clean them up. He could take his pick of them, like a store, he thought. Just like a store, he remembered later how many he ate that day and thought it must have been over 20. It had been a feast day, his first feast day, and a celebration of being alive. He had a new way, and the new way he had of getting food. By the end of the day, had become dark, and when it became dark and he lay next to the fire with his stomach full of fish and grease from the meat smeared around his mouth, he could feel new hope beginning inside him. Not hope he would be rescued, that was gone, but hope in the knowledge, hope in the fact that he could learn to survive and take care of himself. Tough hope, he thought that night. I am full of tough hope.